Welcome. This is the lecture from last Thursday. Sorry to be a little bit late about posting it. Today we're going to continue the discussion of social influence, specifically focusing on those aspects relating to obedience. We'll also look at a classic obedience study, the Milgram study, which you are probably quite familiar with. I will, however, teach you about some variations on the Milgram study that are a little bit less commonly known. And as you're thinking about all of this material, the intriguing question for today is what can the lessons of social psychology research teach us to enable us to be disobedient when conscience asks us to? And that's a very important thing to consider in your life. So first, a couple of announcements. I will be releasing the exam results this week. You need to get that graded first. Those of you who are in the Tuesday-Thursday class, just remind you to look at your syllabus and the due dates on the right-hand column of the class schedule. You'll see there that there is an assignment coming up due on March 4th. And the assignment is the annotated references assignment. And if you have not looked at the feedback from your references assignment, then please do that, because that will be very helpful in terms of doing a better job of the annotated references assignment. So what is obedience? Obedience, as we noted before, is changing one's behavior in response to a directive from an authority figure. So two critical features here are it's a direct communication and it's coming from an authority figure. So when we think about conforming or obeying an authority, we do need to think of a couple of things that are related to that, and that is our social roles. One is thinking about who is an authority, what defines whether a person is authority or not. And partly we authorize or give permission, or in some ways permit a person to be an authority over us. For example, a police officer is someone that society has agreed is an authority on enforcing the law. We give that person that authority, and they fulfill that role in society for us. A subordinate is a person who must follow the directives of the authority. It's a person who is expected by virtue of their social role to follow the directives of the authority. So an example here might be a parent is an authority to a child, who's a subordinate in that relationship. In some educational settings, we might think of the teacher as the authority on the subject matter and the student as a subordinate who listens to the directives of the authority. In your employment setting, your boss might be considered the authority and you the subordinate. But we can also have in educational and workplace settings equal status relationships where we work with one another in a collaborative, less authoritative structure. So the classic obedience study, of course, is Stanley Milgram's obedience study. And just as a reminder, the basic idea here is that research participants enter into the sort of lobby area of the experiment, as it were, and the experimenter introduces the experiment to the teacher and the learner, the research participants who are sitting there in the waiting room, and he basically explains that there's going to be an experiment that is focusing on the role of punishment in encouraging people to learn, and then through what appears to be random assignment, which is actually rigged, one person is assigned the learner role and one person is assigned the teacher role. The learner is a confederate of the researcher, and he is going to be trying to learn while the teacher encourages that learning through the use of electric shocks when the learner gets the question wrong. Everything is very scripted, and what happens is the teacher is encountering a situation where the learner is frequently getting the answer wrong and is instructed, the teacher is instructed by the researcher to administer a shock to encourage learning. And when the teacher begins to be concerned about the shocks being delivered by him or herself to the learner, the experimenter just uses a standard set of prompts, something like the experiment must continue if we are to learn anything from this type of research. If we had a face-to-face class, I would have brought out my replica of the Stanley Milgram shock generator and given you a little demonstration in class what that would look like and how it might be experienced by the research participants. But since we didn't have that opportunity, I would direct you to a couple of videos on the internet. One is a 10-minute segment, but it has, starting at minute 3:10, 3 minutes 10 seconds, a section that's focused on the Milgram study itself, an original recording of the Milgram study participants. And in case you're feeling like that couldn't possibly happen today, there's a more recent reenactment of that with real participants in the United Kingdom, and there is a brief segment of that recording also on the second video you see there. So I would rather have you look at those videos than go through these slides in detail here, but essentially what we're looking at here is a summary of how the person responds to each level of shock in a scripted fashion. When you get up to about moderate shock or strong shock, the learner responds with pleas to get out of the experiment. They complain that the shocks are being painful at this point. They might say when they get into very strong shock, they might say things like, my heart condition is hurting me right now, I'm worried about my health. And all the while, the experimenter is saying things like, treat no response as a wrong response, or the experiment must continue, please deliver the next higher level of shock. And it goes on and on like that. And the surprising finding is that many research participants in the role of the teacher continue following the directives of the authority, even though it appears as though the person is experiencing extreme pain and eventually goes silent after complaining of a heart condition. So the point is, the punchline of this is all the way at the end, we see that a great number of participants continue to the very end. And on the next slide, we see a good, clear presentation of how many participants continued on. So what we have is, in the far left side, the percentage of participants who continued all the way to the end, that is the XXX, when the researcher is commanding that the shocks continue. So 65% of participants in the original version of the study, where the teacher is in one room and the learner is segregated off in another room out of sight, and the researcher is commanding more and more shock throughout. 65% of people went all the way to the end where the shock generator read XXX. What we see in the next column over, 20%, is where a fellow participant who was actually a confederate of the researcher was commanding more shock. So what we have here is a variation between the green bar and the white bar. The green bar is an actual professor who's a researcher with a white lab coat on, who appears as though appears as a scientific authority. Now, in the white condition that you see there on the right-hand side, there you have a situation where the researcher in the white lab coat and the professor authority is not commanding the extra shock. He's said before he left that he wants the shocks to continue for the participants in the study, but it's actually two people sitting there at the shock generator, and the fellow participant, who appears to the naive participant as just another psychology student or another community member participating, he is the one that is commanding extra or additional shock. And you see that the level of compliance or the level of obedience to authority there is considerably less, and that's probably because the person who's just a fellow subject is not seen as a legitimate authority. You see even less going all the way to the end when it's the victim who's saying through the glass or through the intercom, hey, you have to continue shocking me. Or you also see 0% extending all the way to the XXX level when two researchers are issuing contradictory commands. In other words, it's not clear what the authority actually wants because they're disagreeing. I'll also say that there are some other variations on the classic Milgram study, and there are many different variations, but I'm going to boil them down to 4 primary variations because they are quite important to understanding how people respond to the authority's commands. So first, I'll say there's an emotional distance variation. Here we have a situation where in one situation the research participant who's playing, or the confederate who's playing the role of the learner, is either sitting right beside the person administering the shocks, or, as described in the original study, is off in a separate room behind closed doors with only an intercom communicating what he or she is experiencing. What you find there is that when the person is sitting right beside the person receiving the shocks, that they are much less likely to continue providing additional electric shock. That closeness or proximity to the person who's experiencing the pain of electric shock actually encourages people to disobey the authority. It's also the case that they did an experiment where they had another research participant, again, who was kind of pretending to be a research participant, there with the real participant, and both of those people were in the role of teacher, and so they were shocking some other third person who was the learner, also a confederate. Here, where the confederate in the role of teacher was actually disobeying the researcher's commands to continue, there the naive participant, the real participant, was more likely to disobey the authority when another person that they thought was a participant was also disobeying. So that's an indication that when other people are disobedient, it emboldens people to be disobedient themselves. Another thing that Milgram was interested in is the extent to which an institution provides some sort of authority or legitimacy of authority. What he thought is that at a university, in a university setting, that people would see the researcher authority as being more of an authority and be more likely to obey him or her. So what he did was conduct the research study, the Milgram Classic Study, in one setting, which was at Yale University, and in another setting, which was off campus in an industrial area, basically in an old warehouse. In that second setting, people also were dressed in plain street clothes, whereas at the institutional setting of the university, people were dressed as scientists in formal lab coats, etc. There was some reduction in the amount of obedience in that off-site location, but not nearly as much as Milgram expected, and we'll see that change in a graph here in a moment. Lastly, he looked at the proximity and legitimacy of authority. Basically, with the proximity of the authority, he would have the researcher who was commanding additional shock either immediately beside or in the same room as the person doing the quote-unquote teaching, or he would have the researcher in a different building calling in instructions over an intercom or a telephone. As you might imagine, there was somewhat less obedience when the authority was at a distance. Similarly, the legitimacy of the authority is about whether or not the person who's giving the commands to the research participant to teach the other person with shocks is seen as a real quote-unquote scientist or authority of a scientific nature. And there they varied whether or not the person giving the commands to continue was introduced as a psychologist and research professional, or whether the person giving the commands to continue was introduced as an advanced student or a graduate student. As you might imagine, people were more obedient to the professor and legitimate scientist than they were to the advanced student. So on this slide we have a graphic presentation of some of the differences between the different conditions, and they tell us a little bit about how people respond to authority and what things they care about. So on the far left-hand side we see kind of the standard condition where two people come into the laboratory. One of them is assigned to the teacher role, that's the real participant. One of them is assigned to the learner role, that's the Confederate participant. And when the researcher is standing there and commanding that the study go on and additional shocks be provided, fully 65% will go all the way to the end to that XXX version of shocks at the very far right-hand side of the shock generator. When the learner is close, that is sitting right beside rather than off in another room as in the standard condition, there is almost half as much obedience. We see it all the way down to 30%, actually less than half. When we have a graduate student in the room and the real quote-unquote professor or real scientific authority is no longer present, that's when we see it drop down to almost 20%. As I noted in the previous slide, when they conducted these studies off campus in a warehouse kind of setting with people in informal clothes, there was not as much of a reduction in obedience as Milgram anticipated. It was still quite high. Almost 50% of people went all the way to the end. And then the lowest amount of obedience is observed when there is a Confederate teacher who's pretending to be a teacher alongside of the other teacher who's the real teacher, real research participant, and that Confederate teacher is disobeying. He or she is saying things like, well, I don't care what the researcher says, I'm not going to shock this guy anymore. In that kind of situation, you see that only 10% of participants continued all the way on to the XXX at the end of the shock generator. Some people have argued that authorities can give commands that are unethical or ask us to do things that are harmful to others in many different settings, and one of those settings is in military settings. There's, of course, a role for harm in military conflicts, that's obvious, but there are also rules of engagement that many armies and military bodies follow. And so in some settings they do argue that there are unethical commands or unethical obedience. And one example of that, at least in U.S. history, is considered the My Lai massacre, which occurred in Vietnam. In the My Lai massacre, in the Vietnam conflict, Lieutenant Calley directed his troops to open fire on a group of individuals who were in a small village in the jungle. Those individuals included men and women, young children and old people, and they were apparently unarmed. And Lieutenant Calley asked his troops, commanded his troops to open fire on these people who were standing in front of their little straw huts in the jungle there. He commanded them to open fire on these folks. And many people were massacred, as the name suggests. People who studied this after the fact, Kelman and Hamilton, asked the American public who was at fault or what should have been done by those soldiers when they faced the command by their Lieutenant Calley to open fire on apparently unarmed individuals. Some of those individuals when the American public was surveyed about this issue, some of them said that it was important for the soldiers to do what they were told, and that's their role. I mean, that doing what they're told in the military is following the rules, and it was therefore perfectly acceptable for those soldiers to fire upon the unarmed people because they were told to, and that was the rule that they have to follow when they're in the military. This is referred to as a rule orientation. Other people were saying that part of your role as a soldier is to obey the commands of your superior officers, and therefore it's important to be consistent with your role as a soldier and as a subordinate to follow those rules and those role expectations, and that's a role orientation. And finally, some individuals who were surveyed were basically saying that it was wrong for the soldiers to open fire and that they should have questioned the authorities' commands. And they should have questioned those authorities' commands by looking at their own values and deciding whether it was right or wrong to shoot on unarmed people. And here, people were saying that the most important thing to do in a situation where you're not certain whether the authority is issuing a ethically correct command is to engage in principled disobedience after you've looked at your own values. Recently, social psychologists, most notably Philip Zimbardo, has said similar things have occurred in recent military conflicts, and he points to the abuses in military prisons at Abu Ghraib as an example. And that link that you see there has an interesting discussion of these issues. So why do people obey? Well, there are a number of different explanations, and perhaps the most general is that the authority has legitimacy, and that legitimacy is bound to different bases of power that we give to an authority. So, for example, we might say that we are going to obey an authority because he or she has expert knowledge about a situation, and that is why. We might also obey an authority because we have given or understand them to have some kind of moral expertise, and we listen to what they say because of their moral knowledge or understanding. We might also obey authority because they have some kind of power over us, such as the ability to affect our outcomes that we care about. So our employer, for example, we might obey him or her because if we don't, we might get fired and lose our job. In terms of obedience to unethical commands, these three processes, authorization, routinization, and dehumanization, are processes that have been identified by social psychologists that are more likely to lead people to be obedient to unethical commands. Authorization involves a process by which people make a decision in their minds that the authority who's giving the command has been given the responsibility to make to suffer and bear the moral consequences of the of the commands. And so what we're talking about here is that if a police officer, for example, tells you to drive down a road, and even though the street lights are out, and you're worried about running into somebody who's walking on that street, you may decide, okay, I'm going to drive down that street anyway, because if I run over someone, well, it's the police officer's fault. So you've authorized the police to make the ethical decision about whether it's okay to drive down this dark street without your headlights, for example. Routinization is when people break up an unethical act into a set of routines that make it's a bit like a foot in the door effect. So, for example, if you're working as a brake repairman, or brake repair woman, as it were, and you are told by your boss to cut corners on the parts that are used for replacing brake systems, you might see that as an unethical command because it could risk somebody's life when they're driving. And if they just asked you, hey, don't bother replacing that part in the brake system, you might object to that and avoid doing it and basically be disobedient. On the other hand, if your employer broke that process of not repairing the brakes adequately into a series of small routines or parts of the process, then you may be more likely to obey because you won't be concerned about any particular part of the action leading to the consequence that you find objectionable. Dehumanization is often seen in settings like military settings where the person who may be harmed or even killed by following an unethical command is dehumanized. When we use names and labels to make a person less than human, and our authorities are doing that as well, that can help us follow rules or follow commands that are unethical and may lead to someone being harmed. So, as I was suggesting, there are kind of foot in the door kinds of commands, foot in the door kinds of processes involved in routinization. We also see both normative and informational kinds of influence being involved in obedience to unethical commands. Normative influence is when we are thinking of the authority as being able to take over the moral or normative aspects of the behavior that's being requested or demanded. And similarly, informational influence may occur when we think that the authority has some knowledge of the situation that we don't, and therefore we authorize him or her to make the decisions that we don't fully understand. So why do we conform? A second part of this, we talked about some initial goals in social influence. We yield to social influence often to achieve one of or more of three basic goals. One is to choose correctly, that's for informational influence. One is to gain social approval, that's normative influence. And finally, we also want to be consistent with commitments that we've made publicly. So if you say to someone, I'm going to run a half marathon, then we follow through with that because we don't want to be seen as going back on our word. Or if we tell someone we're going to complete our homework on time, we do that. We're more likely to do that because we've said publicly that we want to do that or that we're going to do that, and we want to be seen as consistent with our commitments. So expanding on those ideas, when we are trying to choose correctly, if that's a social goal we have, it's consistent with our basic motive for competence and to master our environments and to connect rewards and resources to our behavior. And in order to be competent, we must make correct choices. And if we're unsure of ourselves, then we look to others for information. We look to the behavior of others for the right thing to do. We look to others' behavior for information about what is appropriate and how we should see reality ourselves. So the best illustration we've had of that so far is the Musafar-Sharif study, the ambiguous light situation. In those kind of ambiguous or unclear situations, we tend to look to others as a source of information to help us decide. So authorities can also be quite influential because they are often experts. And if we are trying to make the correct decision, if we're trying to have the correct understanding of a situation, then we are likely to look to expert authorities as a way of doing that. So expert power is an aspect of is an aspect of an authority's power that gives them capacity to influence us because we want to know what they want to know, and that will help us make the correct decision. Two other sources of authority power that I already kind of mentioned is coercive power. This is when an authority has the power to either give us rewards that we're interested in or to punish us. So your boss, for example, with coercive power has the capacity to give you a bonus or a raise. He or she also has the capacity, the power to lay you off or fire you. And legitimate power is when an authority has been given that power by a group of people that he or she represents. So for example, a student class president has legitimate power through the basis of the electoral process. The textbook, by the way, has a humorous example of a medical expertise as a basis of power. Look at the eardrops that got inserted in the R ear, and that is, of course, sometimes interpreted by somewhat less than right medical assistants by putting drops in the rear as opposed to the right ear. Social validation is the process that we looked at in social influence and in persuasion. It's an interpersonal way to locate and validate the correct choice. People look to the behavior of similar others, or look to the number or frequency or percentage of other people who are engaging in similar behavior. The larger number of people, particularly the larger number of people similar to the observer, the more persuasive it is. So it's the number or percentage of people and also that similarity. As it notes here, consensus and similarity are linked. We are especially likely to follow the behavior of others when there's a strong consensus, when most, or if not all of the other people are doing the same behavior, then we're more likely to follow along with, and that is especially true if the people that we see are very similar to us. So here is an example of a study that shows the combination of several factors that we've summarized so far. If we're unsure about ourselves, actually if we're unsure about our perception of reality, and if we have a desire for accuracy, that can influence how we respond to persuasion, particularly informational influence. So in this study, people were asked to look at an ambiguous situation. There's a simulation of a crime, and then they have to choose a criminal suspect from a lineup, and they're not really sure which of those criminals in the lineup, or suspected criminals in the lineup, is the person that they saw. And in this simulation, some of the research participants saw the pictures very quickly, so it was hard for them to be certain about their conclusions. Others had plenty of time to study the pictures in the photo lineup very carefully so they could be more certain about who matched their memory of the simulated crime. So it really shows in this study, it's kind of setting up the tension between informational and normative influence. In addition to the setup I've given you here, they also had incentives for being accurate and no incentives for being accurate in some other conditions. So some were motivated to be very accurate because they were promised a $20 prize if they guessed correctly. Others, basically 50% of the study, didn't have that incentive. People were randomly assigned to these conditions. So what we see on the next slide is the interaction between the desire for accuracy and the percent conforming with another person who was making identification in the photo lineup before the real research participant. So in the top line, what you see, when participants are unsure of themselves, that is, they've not been given much time to view the photos, and with that very quick review, they're not really sure of themselves in terms of their identification. Those people who did not have much desire for accuracy or incentive for accuracy, those people actually didn't conform much when there was little incentive for accuracy. But when there was high incentive for accuracy, they actually conformed with or matched their guesses with the people before them at a much higher rate. So moving from left to right, we see when they were incentivized to be accurate, but they were in a very unsure situation because they were unable to look at the photographs for very long, that's when they conformed more, when there was an incentive to be accurate. On the other hand, when the participants had a lot of time to view the photographs carefully and therefore be more sure of their guesses, when there wasn't much incentive to be accurate, they were almost identical to those people in the uncertain situation. They didn't really conform much, but when they were highly motivated to be accurate, they actually conformed less. So in other words, when they were desiring to be accurate, They followed their own sense of the world when they had an opportunity to be certain, when it was a less ambiguous situation. But when they were more uncertain, it was more difficult. With a brief review of the photographs, they actually conformed more. So in this top line, you see more normative kind of influence when people are unsure of themselves. Actually, I'm sorry, back up. On the top line, you see more informational influence. People are unsure of themselves because they haven't had much time to look at the photographs, and they actually think that other people might have information that helps them, and so they conform more in the high motivation situation. On the other hand, on the bottom, you see normative pressure on the low side and non-normative pressure on the high side. So people are motivated to fit in, normative influence because of our interdependence. If we don't fit in, people reject us. We may have more difficulty getting support and help from others. And so fitting in is quite important to us because of our interdependence. Groups put strong pressure on those with deviant positions, as you probably just learned with your homework. And so we really are often very influenced by normative pressures because we do want to fit in and we don't want to be rejected because of our weird behavior. It is true that while that's generally the case across many social groups and situations, it is the case that some people and some cultures place higher importance on fitting in than others. So far, in the first lecture and the second lecture on social influence, we've really been putting a lot of emphasis on how people respond to social influence by conforming. Certain factors can cause people to be able to resist social influence, and we've already highlighted some of that. We saw that when we have other people present who are dissenting or disagreeing with social influence, both in the Milgram study and in the Ash study, we see that people resist persuasion and do more independent behavior when they see other people doing the same thing. It's also the case that if you have made a prior public commitment to one type of behavior, then when conformity pressures encourage you to behave in a different way, you're more likely not to conform when you've made that prior public commitment. So expanding on that idea, active and public commitment, one way people come to perceive and define themselves is through an examination of their own actions. We talked about that in self-perception theory earlier in the semester. Like active commitments, public commitments, so telling people out in a public setting, posting it on Facebook, writing it down, putting it on your bedroom wall so that people can see it. Public commitments, especially when freely chosen, I'm going to lose 10 pounds before the end of spring break. You go and tell your old friends that and post it on Facebook, etc. Those kinds of things lead to consistent future behavior because they tend to alter self-image and there is social accountability associated with it. The program The Biggest Loser on television is an example of this kind of public commitment process. So here's an example from research. Students in this experiment were asked to judge lines in an Ash-type experiment. Remember, that's 3 lines being, and the person is asked to match a 4th line to one of those 3 lines. Before hearing group members make an erroneous judgment, as is what you saw in the original Ash-type experiment, some people were instructed to write down their judgments privately, and this is what we refer to as an active commitment only. Others wrote down their judgments and gave them to the experimenter. So the first we have, I'm making a judgment, I'm writing it down, I know what it is, I've written it down. The second one is the same, plus I give it to the experimenter so the experimenter knows what I've said as well. So that's kind of like a public commitment in the sense that the experimenter is going to know if I change my mind or not. Those people who made no commitment to their original decision, okay, so people who did not make a previous judgment, were much more likely to conform with the group pressure. So they kind of caved into normative pressure on that Ash-type experiment. They've read along with the erroneous views of others. On the other hand, those people who made a private commitment increased the likelihood of sticking with their original judgment, So this is the active only. And keep in mind, over on the left-hand side, you see sticking with original judgment. These are people who either did it privately, active only, or active and public. That's the last one here. So basically what we're seeing here is people are more likely to respond to conformity pressures, particularly normative pressures, when they are not making a prior commitment, and they're more likely to stick with their prior judgments when they make an active commitment, and even more likely when it's active and they've committed to it in public. So that's an indication of the kinds of things that can help you avoid social pressure. That is, if you express what your views are prior to experiencing social pressure, particularly if you express those views publicly. So if we were doing an in-class segment of this course, this lecture, I would ask people to kind of share their experiences of the deviance homework. But unfortunately, we weren't able to do that. But what I often encourage people in this discussion to consider is whether the situation that they were in was a strong or a weak situation, whether the norm that they violated was a descriptive norm or an injunctive norm. Consider such things as the number of people present when the norm violation occurred, what types of social sanctions were experienced. Did people use nonverbal sanctions? Did they frown or disapprove in that way? Did they use words like actually tell a person directly not to behave in the way that they did? And also we have a lot of fun having people report the feelings that they had privately when they were violating norms. Often it's very uncomfortable for us to be deviant. And that concludes the lecture segment for